Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all here today. Thank you for joining my session. I assume the other one was full, and that's why the overflow crowd had to come into this one, so I appreciate not squeezing in there and joining us for a little while. Everyone knows what that is.
Foxhole.
That's a foxhole. There is a saying, which I actually disagree with, that says there are no atheists in foxholes. This is not true. There are atheists in foxholes. I know some. And they are atheists, and they are in foxholes. Famously, Christopher Hitchens wrote about how he was an atheist in a foxhole, and that if he ever started saying things about how he believed in God, it should be ascribed to delusions of a sick man who had no longer had capacity over his own mind. Very much an atheist in a foxhole. That's not as interesting a question to me as the question we're going to address today. The question we're going to address is whether there's such a thing as empathy in a foxhole. See that foxhole? There's soldiers in there. Their lives are at risk. Their comrades are in battle. Their enemies are trying to harm them. And they have friends and family at home who are thinking about their welfare and hoping for the best for their soldiers, but also for themselves. Is there a place for empathy in this scenario? Is there something that can be done to either support an argument that says that there should be empathy between the soldiers and their families with their enemies, or counter-argument that says, of course, there should not be empathy between a person and their enemies? That's what we're going to discuss today. So we talked about this class. This lecture is empathy in a foxhole. And the challenge for us as Jewish people who are engaged in community work and thinking about issues as they relate to the person, the family, community, globally, as we get more and more outward, should we be trying to empathize with Israel's enemies? Whether we agree or disagree with politics or military strategy and decisions, our brothers and sisters in Israel are living in harm's way. And the question arises whether we have a duty to those people to give them our uncompromised support, and perhaps that would include not sympathizing or empathizing with the enemy. Or maybe our role is to be empathetic because we are not in harm's way, and we have the opportunity to think about things from a perspective that does not require us to fear for our lives. My name is Eliyahu Fink. I'm the rabbi of the Pacific Jewish Center on Venice Beach in California. And yes, it is the shul on the beach. It is as cool as it sounds. It's literally on the beach. And I invite you to join me anytime you'd like to come and visit me at the shul. I have to reciprocate because I have been invited here. So everybody that comes here is now invited to be with us. I do confess that even if you weren't here, you'd be invited anyway. But I do want to thank the UC Hillel for the hospitality for this event, and to the Hartman Institute, iEngage, for having me here today to talk about this. And this is our question: empathy in a foxhole. We have to begin this discussion with a much more fundamental question. What is empathy? It's a word that gets used very often today. It's a very millennial word. I am a millennial. I was born after 1980, believe it or not. And my generation speaks about empathy almost as much as the 70s generation spoke about acid. It's almost like our drug. In the presidential race in 2008, President Barack Obama spoke about empathy and how the generation of people who are now, I would say, 15, 16, 17 years old, he was talking to a grade school child at the time. He says the challenge of your generation and the role of your generation will be empathy. The word gets tossed around a lot. What does it mean? It's a pretty recently invented word. Can't find the word empathy before the 19th century. It's a new word. Certainly the theories and the ideas that are described by the word existed way before the word was invented. But as a concept in the zeitgeist, this is a relatively recent innovation. So the word is still evolving, and therefore becomes hard to define. What do you think the word empathy means? And this is where your chance to tell me what you think.
Putting yourself in the shoes of another.
So that's a great way of describing it. It's like almost that's the process. What does that mean practically?
To feel their feelings.
So we're going from a metaphor to the literal, right? So that's the Hasidic and the Misnagdim. So what does it mean to feel the other person's feelings? How does that manifest? What do you mean by feeling the other person's feelings?
I think it's to erase the boundaries between your own internal sense, emotional state, and the circumstances of this other person so that you can be incongruous with them.
Right, and what you're saying seems to be like we're trying to say, and this is where the metaphor comes in, there's no difference between you and I. You feel something, I feel something. The perfect case example of this is something I learned when I was in yeshiva, where the rabbi of Jerusalem in the middle of the 20th century, it was named Rabbi Aryeh Levin, famous rabbi. And he would go with his wife to the doctor, and doctor would ask, what's wrong? He would say, our foot is hurting. Because he would feel what she felt. That was their love. I think that's a good way of looking at empathy. Did you want to say something different, or do you want to say the same thing?
Oh, it's just acknowledging that another person is feeling distress.
Excellent. Now that's an important step. That's part of the process. We're going to get to that soon. And I think that that's probably the biggest secret about the whole thing. And it's probably the hardest thing about the whole thing. We'll get there soon. And that is part of what gets from a person from point A, where you're a non-empathetic person, to point B, where you can start feeling another person's feelings. So I think that we've got some good ideas. Anybody want to add a little bit to this? Yes, sir.
Well, I was just going to say to take it from maybe a little more neutral, is to simply be able to understand another's position. I don't think you have.
So the feelings are voluntary, kind of.
Well, not voluntary.
Oh, okay.
It may be actually impossible.
Mm.
And having just read a piece the other day written by a black person who welcomed white participation in the marches, but said, "Why are you holding your hands up?" Saying don't shoot when you don't face that. So you may say, I want to be exactly like you. You can't. That's
Right.
what the writer was trying to say. So I just want to suggest that without accepting the other person's position, that you can understand, I don't know how to explain it, articulate, discuss, be aware of, almost without sympathy to what that other position might be.
Right, and this is an important point. Sometimes empathy can seem paternalistic or patronizing. Because how could you know what it feels like to be me? And in the case of somebody who has no relationship with another person, it's merely sociological, it's much harder. But in other cases where there is an intimate connection between two people, whether it's a friendship or a marriage or a parent-child, it sometimes can be easier because they do have those experiences that they share in common. But empathy can work in both cases. We're going to talk about the challenges of both of those. Yes?
Implicit in this is an assumption that you have the power to understand or to know how someone else is feeling.
Absolutely. I mean, nobody has questioned this, and thank you for doing this. The question really is, can we do this? Is there something to this process of empathy, or is it just one of those things the young kids talk about, and they don't know what they're talking about because they're so young and immature, they haven't experienced life, they don't know there's no such thing as empathy. It's a false god. And we'll see. I think that if we can define a process by which we can say that there is a way to achieve it, that it must exist, at least in that sense. But it's possible. In fact, it's likely that there are people who speak about empathy in a way that is impossible to achieve, and it's almost something that is beyond the capability of normal people, and even the most empathic person would not be able to do what they think they can do. Yeah?
Perhaps all we can do is just approximate.
Right. So there's going to be a challenge, a discussion we're going to have will be whether or not it's something that we have to go all the way with, or it's something that can be bifurcated or talked about in pieces, or if it's something that requires us to literally put ourselves in their shoes, which means like, give me your shoes and I'll put them on, or is it something that is more symbolic or intellectual, as was suggested over here?
And perhaps I really don't want to empathize with you. After all, in the 19th century, you're a slave owner. I really don't want to empathize with you.
Right, so there's another challenge that exists, which is if you empathize with somebody who is offended by your empathy.
Or you're offended by it.
Either way, right? But both ways matter. The point is that empathy, it should take into account the other person's experience and feelings if that's the goal. Yeah?
I just wanted to point out that one thing that you find is empathy or caring about people. It has evolutionary benefits. And in fact, it's seen in primitive animals. So that, you know, it was not invented by mankind. If you ever watch animals, my dogs always breathe if I look like I'm sick.
Right, of course, we all hear about, especially with dogs, the empathy that they have. And the question we're challenging ourselves with is, what does it mean for us as humans? We have more of a choice in these matters. So in these things that we can...
Elephants, they're kind of, you know, they really are very closely emotionally.
They're connected emotionally. Yeah.
Very emotionally.
Okay, we'll do one more and we're going to continue after this. Yes?
So just if it is possible, it involves a dimension of abandoning yourself, or leaving yourself, or even maybe forgetting, letting go of who you are, if it's possible.
And sometimes it might be that. That's the type of thing that we started with, was this putting yourself into somebody else's shoes. That's saying, I'm no longer in my own shoes, I'm in somebody else's shoes. Well, here's a good example of empathy, right? So this is something that we can all understand. The caption says, it helps me empathize. And for me, this is perfect, because it talks in a very superficial, humorous way about what empathy means. It means that the doctor makes us feel uncomfortable. Every time we go to the doctor, we feel uncomfortable. And when we feel uncomfortable, something that helps us sometimes is to know that the other person feels uncomfortable. It's sharing a common emotion, even if it's manufactured, which is the important thing. My discomfort of being the patient is because naturally the patient's going to be uncomfortable taking down their trousers in front of a stranger or a doctor or whatever it is. They're in a compromised position. The doctor doesn't have to do that to get examined, but the doctor does it voluntarily to empathize. It's very superficial. It's very contrived. But yet it can work. It can show the person that's feeling compromised that they feel something that you can understand and you can feel as well. So, what is empathy? We've taken a lot of ideas from you. We've had a little discussion about how it looks to us and how it sounds to us and what it feels like to us. Was all that helpful? Yes, it was helpful. Was the cartoon helpful? Sure, the cartoon is helpful. But I always think it's instructive to look into our ancient texts to see if there's anything that we can learn about sociology, psychology, the world we live in, and if we can, to see if the words that we see in that text can speak to us today. And there's a perfect verse for this. It's a verse from Isaiah 63. Biblical empathy. The prophet proclaims that God says, B'kol tzarotam lo tzar, which means in all of their pain, in all of their suffering, speaking about the people of Israel, lo tzar, God has pain and suffering as well. Now, of course, it's impossible that God could feel pain. Pain feels like something is wrong, like something's missing, like you want to feel better. An infinite, perfect being cannot feel that. But the verse uses this descriptive language despite the fact that it's impossible for God to feel that way. That tells us something very important. Empathy does not require that the feelings be actually the same. It would be impossible. Empathy merely requires that the person that's on the receiving end of the empathy, the Israel in this case, feels that the person or the thing, like in this case God, is empathetic towards them. It's about their subjective feelings, not about the objective truth. It's very important to understand that. Because when we talk about empathy, we sometimes get caught up in wondering if it's true, if it's real. And God's real empathy cannot be real. It doesn't mean that God feels pain. But it gives us that feeling that God feels that way. And God commands us to follow in God's ways. And therefore, we see that this kind of empathy, feeling what others feel, but even in a sense that it's not really feeling it, it's just expressing that we feel it, that is empathy. And the way it sounds in this verse is not just that God has empathy, that God feels pain. It will be enough to say God feels pain. It says, B'kol tzarotam lo tsar. In all of their pain and suffering, to God there is pain. Which means, and this is the most important ingredient to the entire discussion, it's what was mentioned earlier, empathy requires validation, acknowledgement. This is the physical act of empathy, right? Every emotion has ways that it shines through in our actions. We want to be empathetic, but that's not an action, that's an emotion. So what are the actions? What are the motions for the emotion? And the motion, the thing that we do that creates the space for empathy is validation. To say that there is pain. You are feeling pain. I understand that there is pain here. That is the hardest part of empathy, because we are uncomfortable acknowledging other people's pain. Makes us feel, yeah, everybody has problems. Your problems, I have problems. Get over it. We don't like to give people the satisfaction of knowing that we acknowledge that they have pain. People, and this is something that you'll experience. You'll have a conversation with somebody, and they'll actually argue with you about your own feelings. See, I feel this way about something. Like I'll speak from an example from my childhood. Like, so some people don't do well in certain school environments, right? Not everybody is successful in every institution. So a guy goes to a certain yeshiva, and he has a terrible experience. He's failing his classes, misbehaving, gets kicked out of the place, and many years later he meets up with somebody and they play Jewish geography, of course. What yeshiva did he go to? Oh, I went to yeshiva Derech Esav. And when the fellow says, oh, that yeshiva, I heard it's a great yeshiva, you must have loved it. And the guy says, no, actually it was the worst yeshiva I ever went to, and I hated it, and I did terrible there. It's not an abnormal reaction for the person to say that's impossible. I know the rabbi's there. Like, we argue about it objectively, like as if there's some sort of truth here that we can discuss. Is it a good place? Is it a bad place? That's something that we tend to do. And we will have an intellectual debate about something without acknowledging first that person's feelings and saying, that must have been terrible that you hated it. Tell me what it was like to be there in that environment. But if something is in conflict with something that we believe already, we're less willing to go through that motion of validating the pain. It happens in politics too. It's a discussion between conservatives and liberals, and one side will say that this is the way it happened in my life, and the other side will say, but there's this axiom that says that it doesn't happen that way. It doesn't matter. If the person felt that way, empathy means validating their pain. This verse clearly does that. B'chol tzarotam lo tsar. And that is the hard part. And then after that, we start to feel a connection with that other person's pain. Saying the words, acknowledging to ourselves that we are validating another person's pain, has the effect of connecting us to their feelings. in the case of humanity, and in the case of specifically the Jewish people, there's an added benefit. God himself, God says that God feels this empathy. God says that the people of Israel are affecting, as if it were possible, God's mood. There's a reason for this. There is a connection between us and God. It pre-exists. But it goes beyond the Jewish people. We all share, Tzelem Elokim, we all share being in the image of God, created in the image of God. And so for God, we are all already part of God's flesh, as it were. This is what the Tomer Devorah, great book by Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, 16th century Seifed, writes about this in his book, that people from the group, whether it's the group of family, the group of a community, the group of the Israel community, the group of the entire Jewish world, the group of any group, when one person feels pain in that group, it is not as if there's an external thing that is feeling pain. It is like our own hand, our own flesh, because we can actually express it that way. It almost feels like we are that person's flesh. We share so much. Adam Smith, famous economist, game theory, wrote that the thing that makes us moral, what is the thing that defines our morality? But the thing that makes us moral is our ability to place ourselves in the situations of others. To feel like we are part of one thing and that other person's pain is not external to mine. It is like my own hand feeling pain. V'kol tzar otam lo tzar. When we validate another person's feelings, when we start to feel that connection between us and them, we change the discussion. We change our connection to them. Because when we don't do this, we look at other people and we see their pain, we don't go through this exercise of empathy, it is looking at them through a window. What does it mean to look at somebody through a window? It means that you have a barrier between the two of you and you see that other person. You cannot touch them. And you don't see yourself either. You see the thing on the outside. By asking the question of how to change that window into a mirror, we are practicing empathy. The mirror says, I see myself when I look at you. I see that your pain, the thing that hurts you, is the thing that should be hurting me, and does hurt me. The highest level of empathy is to feel this really deep connection with others, the way God feels a connection to all of us, the way we feel a connection towards our most loved ones. There should be no difference between the way we feel about our children or our parents or our spouse and other people. There is, because we practice all these things that make us feel that way. But we're all human. And the things that come between all that are the window pane that make a break between us and the outside world. When we put a mirror, it's really fake. The mirror's fake. That thing that we see in the mirror, that's not us. That's them. We think it's us, which is good. There's a way to get here, and requires us to go back one step more into this discussion about how we interact with each other. And this goes to the levels of communication. We tend to think of communication as very binary. Either you are communicating or you're not communicating. Right? We say, like, people are upset at other people. They say, well, you're not communicating with me. Tell me what you're feeling. Communicate with me. We make it sound like communication is either it's an on switch or an off switch. But the truth is that communication is very subjective. It changes based upon the form of communication and the level of communication. And the first level of communication, the one that is the least effective, is the written word. The written word is least effective because there is no emotion apparent in the words unless you put it in. You can't tell how a person's face looks by seeing their words unless they are a skilled writer. You can't tell what a person is thinking. You can't tell if a person is enjoying themselves or loathing the experience. You can't tell any of that by the written word unless they're an expert, unless they're a skilled writer. Many of us are, but most of us are not. So the written word is the lowest form of communication, and it's very hard to emote through written word. Luckily, we have higher levels of communication, and the next lowest level of communication, ironically enough, is the spoken word. The spoken word is where I speak to you face to face. And when I speak to you face to face, I say words, you hear those words, and you interpret those words. It's a level of communication that is better than the written word because there is a face to put to the words. There are emotions that you can see on what I'm doing. There are feelings that can be projected through what I say. That's spoken word. But it's not enough. The reason it's not enough is because words rarely are the thing that the person is trying to say. Words are a clumsy attempt to say the thing you're trying to say. Every time someone speaks and they put their feelings or their ideas into words, they're reducing them to something smaller than what they are. The words are smaller than the idea. The words are smaller than the feelings. If I'm feeling sad and I say the word, I am sad, that word cannot convey the actual sadness I have. It requires you to say, okay, the word sad means that he's sad. Then you have to say, what does sadness mean? And then you have to start reinterpreting it. And that is empathy. So the third level of communication is empathy. That's where we take the words and we don't just hear the words. We don't just say the definition of those words and interpret them to their literal meaning. We try to understand what those words are saying. And sometimes it's really hard. Sometimes we're really bad at it. We misinterpret things all the time. One of my favorite pastimes is to put my foot in my mouth because I say things because I think I hear what they're saying, but I didn't really hear what they're saying, and it gets me into trouble. I'll never forget, I was dating my wife. And we went to a New York Giants football game, a game where Michael Strahan broke the sacks for a career record when Brett Favre slid in front of him to give him the sack for free. We were like 8 rows back from the game. It was pretty cool. Really cold also. And after the game, we were going back. I think we got something to eat, and we stopped somewhere maybe to get gas or drinks or something, and it was really cold. And it was one of those really old-fashioned cars from the early 2000s, where if you wanted to change the temperature in the car, you had to use a manual knob. I know this, you all live in the future. It's lots of digital buttons nowadays. But this one had a manual knob, and to adjust the volume of air coming out, you also had to turn a knob. One dot was a little bit of volume, and the second dot was a little more. So I had the heat on notch number 1, which is the lowest amount of heat that can blow through the vents at any time, and this was sufficient for me. I went out of the car, and when I came back in, I noticed that the heat had been turned from 1 notch to 3 notches. And my wife, who is now my wife, at that time was not, said to me that she moved the heat up a notch. And me and my stupidity, I was embarrassingly immature for a 20-year-old, I said, no, you moved it 2 notches. Because I heard the words, I moved it a notch, which is an abstract discussion about how many notches the heat knob was moved. But what was she saying? She was saying that she was cold. That is what the words meant if you take the words and add empathy. That's why empathy is a higher level of communication. It doesn't rely just on the words. It doesn't just say, the words are 1 notch, but you did 2 notches. It says, you moved the heat because you were cold. I'm sorry you're cold. I apologize. You can make it as warm as you want. That would have been the appropriate response. And so 13 years later, I'm still trying to do that. And that's the challenge of relationships and communication. Because we hear things, we hear words, and it takes empathy to interpret them. And very rarely, and now that I'm aware of this, and I talk about this, and I write about this, I notice that very rarely when things are important are the words actually what the person means to say. Because they are reducing actual feelings and actual emotions and ideas and things that are powerful into words, which is so difficult. It's like trying to draw a 3-dimensional image on flat paper. You can do it with metaphors, maybe, but it's not the same as a sculpture. So the words turn it into 2-dimensional, the empathy builds it back into 3-dimensional. But there are higher levels of communication in this, believe it or not. The next level of communication is art. This may sound weird. What does it mean that art is a higher level of communication than written, spoken word, and then spoken word plus empathy? And what that means is that sometimes Words reduce things. They make ideas sound smaller. But an artist, even if it's an artist of the written word or the spoken word, can make those words actually bigger or accurately portray the ideas. When you see a painting that speaks to you, if you're the kind of person who appreciates a painting, and if you are, I'd like to speak with you, maybe you could help me with that. There's this feeling that people get where they see a painting and they say, this says everything. It doesn't say anything, it's a painting. But because it's captured the emotions in the paint, on the canvas, because it has used images to tell a story, it can actually be bigger than the emotions that the person was feeling. And that's why once something is art, it no longer matters what the author intended. Read the introduction to Huckleberry Finn. There's like a little introductory paragraph. It says, anyone who tries to make meaning out of this book is a fool. I meant nothing. It's a fun story. And yet every single high school student in this country goes to 10th grade and they read about Huckleberry Finn and they interpret the story to have major metaphors and meaning. Because it doesn't matter what he thought, whether he was telling the truth or whether he was lying. Once something is art, if it's something that has depth and meaning to it, it communicates in this higher level. And there's something that goes beyond written word plus empathy, art. And that is love. Because love requires no communication. When you love, and the love is reciprocal, and you're in the same place as that person, or even far away from that person, you can know what that person's thinking. You can know what that person's feeling without the communication, without the words, without the written words, without the art, without any of it. True love, not Disney love. True love, the kind of love that develops over time, that takes work. That creates a communication of sorts, where if you have worked on this and been aware of it, by the time you have accumulated a certain number of years, the love has its own language, its own song, its own dance, and the communication happens simply by being in the same presence as each other. Judaism operates on all these levels. But the rituals of Judaism, the art and the love of Judaism, is where Judaism is really. The texts are very important. You read texts, you could have background information, written word, open to interpretation. A bunch of people here in this room, I could find plenty of verses that none of us would agree on the interpretation. Because written word is very subjective to what you think it means, especially words that are written without explanation. And the spoken word as well. After this lecture, after this discussion, you will all leave this room. And some of you will have heard some things that I said, and others of you will hear other things that I've said. When I became a rabbi of a shul for the first time, I spoke, it was Yom Kippur, and I literally said A. Like I said very clearly, A. And after the service, somebody went to the president and said, I can't believe the rabbi kept on saying B, the opposite of A. It happened. I know it happened. I was there. I was saying A, and then the person only heard B. And not just that B was different than A. B was the opposite of A. It's crazy. But spoken word gets misinterpreted, or it gets misheard, or it gets added, a person's subjectivity gets added to it. So the place where Judaism really happens is in the art and in the love. We don't celebrate holidays. We don't keep the rituals simply for the legalistic purpose of them. We don't do them just so that we can jump through the hoops and get a point in the scoreboard in the sky. We do them to empathize with the experience that created the ritual. We feel as if we are departing from Egypt at the Seder. We feel as if the world is being created, as if the world is being judged. We have to feel that. And the way that we feel that is A, through art, which includes music, liturgy, and love, devotion. So Judaism has built all these things into its system, but clearly the highest level of communication in Judaism, the place where the beauty is, the place where the majesty of Judaism, that's in the highest level of communication. That's in the art and the love. We don't just remember we empathize. Each one of those rituals is an opportunity to experience it one more time for ourselves. Yeah?
I'd like to add to the list of non-verbal communication. I could be sitting like this. You might interpret it as I'm cold. You might interpret it as I'm bored. Somebody could interpret it some other way.
Correct.
So like
Right. So what I meant, what I should have been a little clearer, what I meant was communication that is intended. Right? If a person is using body language consciously instead of words, then I would agree that it is a level of communication, and I would probably fit into empathy in general. And then in a higher level with love, maybe even art because you're pantomiming. But when we're talking about people that you're observing and you're like, I could tell that person's unhappy without them trying to communicate. I don't call that communication as much. I call that, although it is used sometimes ways, nonverbal communication. I would call that observation of how people feel based upon what you see from them. So it's a little different. These things are where we see an overt attempt to communicate and to create conversation. But I agree, of course, there is nonverbal communication. Yeah.
I'm a little confused.
Oh, sorry.
I understand your hierarchy is set up except for art.
Okay.
So I don't understand why art you see as less subject to interpretation than spoken word.
No, it's not less subject to interpretation, of course not, but it doesn't require the reducing of something into a level that is so difficult to take from the higher to the lower. Our emotions and our feelings are so limited by the simple words we use, but art can be much grander because it speaks in a much more three-dimensional or four-dimensional way. That's why it's a higher level. So if you look at a piece of art, these are not great examples because they're photographs, but even photographs have an emotive sense that is grander than written or spoken word, because you can see the whole thing at once. When you read words, some people read 2 or 3 words at a time, some people read 4 words at a time, but you don't see the whole picture at once. It has a less cohesive sense to it, so you have to kind of put it all together, do math to add the words together, and you have to then rebuild it from the small to the large. It's my personal opinion. I could be wrong.
Okay, just communication, the thing I'm struggling with is that if communication, you seem to imply it has to do with the intent of the communicator. So whereas in written word and spoken word you talk about misinterpretation, whereas in art, taking the line that once an art's created no longer belongs to what the intended piece was, it just feels a little...
It's a fair point, and I'll just give you one thing to help you maybe see it a little differently. There are 2 intents. One intent is the intent to communicate. The other intent is the intent of what is communicated. And art, of course, there is an intent to communicate. And of course, it is also subjective, the same way that written and spoken word are. But it requires less effort to rebuild the emotions that are being expressed in art. And even if your interpretation of them is different, the art is grand enough that it could be a valid interpretation. Okay. So all this stuff is really important in relationships. But it's also really hard. It's not easy to do this. And the reason that it's not easy is the subject that we're going to turn to now for the next few minutes. And even when we want to empathize, or we know we should want to empathize, it doesn't just happen. So we really need to start one step before the empathy and figure out what are the barriers to empathy. What are the barriers to this kind of communication that helps us move beyond ourself? How do we actually get towards empathy before we can discuss whether we can empathize on a foxhole? How do we get there? So first thing is we have to understand there are barriers. We call this the wall. And the wall, if you know what that is, that's thank you. Didn't want to give it away. So the wall is huge, and we are standing on the bottom, and it's really hard to get there. It's a ladder, but it's really high. What are the barriers to empathy? There are 2 significant barriers. I think these encompass almost all the barriers to empathy. The 2 significant barriers, you know what? Maybe I'll take some suggestions. I can write it in with I can do maybe sign language. What do you think the barriers to empathy are? Just because it's hard doesn't mean that there's, hard is not a description of the barrier, it's a description of the status of the barrier. It's hard. What were you saying?
Values, judgments.
So
That you're judging your own personal judgments on what someone else is feeling, or what you think they're feeling.
I agree. A person will prejudge and not be willing to go to that step of trying to understand another person. But that, I think, is a symptom of a broader, yes.
Looking at the wall, I would say
Fear of what?
A fear of your own vulnerability, exposing yourself.
So, you know, I think I agree with you, but I'm not sure how you're vulnerable by, like, I want to understand that feeling. Why would a person feel vulnerable? And then we'll try and build that back into a more broad.
I'm going to a place inside myself where there's not a comfort level going.
And where does that discomfort come from? Like if when that happens, when that happens, you feel the discomfort. What is the discomfort?
Emotional vulnerability that you try to live day-to-day avoid.
An excellent description. I'm going to try and understand what that emotional vulnerability is. We're going to go even into that. Okay? What are you going to say?
Well, like a predisposed knowledge, let's say the Holocaust. We each carry our own baggage pertaining to the Holocaust.
So you're saying we already know.
So
We already know, so I don't have to think about it anymore.
well, I'm not, but it might, let's say something pertaining to Germany because of everything that happened to Jews during the Holocaust. You really have to step beyond your own experience.
Right. So it is hard.
To sympathize with something to perpetrators that, let's say killed 6
Right. I agree with that. We're going to see if we can figure out, again, the same thing. What's the simple word to explain where that comes from? What were you going to say?
I don't have a simple word.
No, it's okay. I want to hear your ideas anyway. We're going to see if we can fill them, we can flesh them all out.
Judgment?
What's that?
I think it's beyond judgment. I think it's that place where we hold values and a value system, that if I empathize with that other, I am unable to hold my values intact.
Beautifully said. And that is actually the biggest challenge we're going to get to when we talk about the Foxhole. And once again, there's a bias, there's something that we have that makes that hard for us. We're going to get to that point. What were you saying?
Judgment.
There's a judgment that was similar to what was said earlier, that we have a hard time, separating our own feelings about what people are doing right and wrong from whether or not we can feel what they feel, which is fair. Reason?
Doubt.
About?
Doubt in trusting myself, doubt in the ideas, doubt and trust everything below that fear.
I agree. There is an issue of, am I strong enough to put myself in, like you were saying, the vulnerable position? And I think that that's very important. We're going to get to the thing that gets there soon. Yeah.
So there's an assumption in your presentation.
Oh, many assumptions.
But there's a big one, it doesn't work for me.
Yes.
Two things don't work, but that somehow we have trouble empathizing. I don't have any trouble empathizing. I have trouble agreeing with them. I have trouble saying I don't want the missiles on my head. I have no trouble empathizing. I'm a mother, I see a child hurt, I have no trouble empathizing
Right.
with a mother. I don't have a whole lot. So that's number one. Number two that I have trouble with, you said if my doctor dropped his pants, I wouldn't feel good about it at all. I wouldn't feel empathy. I would run out of there.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't a true story.
No, I understand that, but the assumption that somehow that the behavior, that there's a contrived behavior that is not felt from the heart is what empathy is, and I don't agree on either point.
Okay, so I'm going to address both of them very quickly, but I have a feeling that you'll feel differently as we get to the end.
Okay.
But first of all, I will say that some people are more drawn towards empathy than others. Personally, now that I've become aware of this and I've worked on this, it's easier for me, and it's sometimes to a fault. Some people say I'm naive. It becomes a flaw in some ways, but that's part of it. That there's also different ways of, dealing with whether we are empathetic or not. But the other idea that you mentioned about, the contrived nature of it, we're gonna see if you can manufacture it, it will still work in a certain way. It's different than the natural way, but we're gonna see if it can work anyway. But you're right, the questions are valid. Okay, we're gonna just do a couple more because I have to finish this before a certain time, unless you want to just skip lunch. Yeah.
If you're looking for one word, I'm just guessing hurt.
Similar to what I was saying earlier, there's a pain involved with kind of stepping outside our own comfort zone. I agree with that. I'm misleading you a little bit. It's fine. It's all part of the game. You'll see what I mean when I press the next button. Yeah.
Practically, lack of perspective. In Hebrew, they say things that you see from here you cannot see from there, and vice versa. Things that you see from there you cannot see or understand
Right? You simply lack the experience to do so.
Right, now, I cannot understand, we as American jury cannot understand the experience, really understand, and that goes back to what you said, how either Israelites or Palestinians feel during the war.
Correct.
No matter how much CNN will
Well, that's a bad idea. But you will see, I think I'll give you a little bit of hope soon. Okay? Hang in there. Somebody here?
Well, I was kind of repeating what's been said before, but personal experience obviously would impact tremendously, would create a wall.
A wall, right? Now, we're going to get to the place where we understand why personal experience is, what that creates in our own minds. Okay, we'll do one more and then we're going to continue. Yes?
About the vulnerability, about fear of judgment, there's this sense of loss of power or control, that you cannot control the situation. If you're empathizing, you're giving up.
That's absolutely true. You're saying, I'm not in charge of how this person feels. I will accept how they feel on their own terms, and that makes us feel like we're no longer in charge, that we are allowing somebody else to control how they feel, and then subsequently our emotions, which can be very, very fearful. Okay, so the correct answer is always the answer that I'm looking for. So the way I look at this is that there are two biases that people have that are part of the human condition. And these biases that we all have in some capacity or another really are the barrier between people and empathy, whether it's natural or they have to get over it, or whether they don't have to get over it, but at a certain point there's going to be these problems that arise. And as I said, and as you will see, honesty with oneself and validation of one's own feelings and what others' feelings, another one's feelings, are the key ingredients, so we're going to have to be honest here. So the first thing I say is that we have a bias towards simplicity. Now, what does it mean to have a bias towards simplicity? We'll get there in a moment, but it sounds very New Agey. You'll see what I mean. All right, and the second bias that we have is a bias towards resolution. And this similarly sounds very New Agey and simple, but I promise that it is something that will make sense in a moment. So let's talk about simplicity first. These biases towards the human condition are things that we all struggle with all the time. The first thing we struggle with is a bias towards simplicity. Now, in order to make this point, I chose the most simplest slide, which is really not simple at all. Now, this is our bias towards simplicity. Now, while I'm speaking, I want you to think about how this is biased towards simplicity. I will be very impressed if somebody gets what I'm thinking about. Now, people are always seeking answers. They want ideas. They want the grand theory of everything. That's what we yearn for. People want an answer for everything. They want to know why, how, explain it all to me. And we want to be able to put it all together, right? So in the late 90s, early aughts, people were evolving past, in their view, religious dogma and theories of philosophy that based themselves on religious ideas. People start talking about physics and the grand theory of everything from quantum physics and string theory. People want, and we all have a bias, to say, this explains everything. Now granted, I'm guilty of the same thing. I'm saying this explains everything, and I believe it does. But just because you have a bias towards it doesn't mean it's wrong. That's also an important thing. Just because you have an agenda or a bias or a predisposed condition doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means you have a harder time making your case. So my case is that we have a bias towards simplicity. Things are almost always more complex than we think. We want to have a grand theory of everything, and that's almost always the wrong answer. But it takes a lot of work to navigate through the nooks and crannies of every challenging problem with the myriad consequences that we have, and we are lazy. We don't want to have to take that journey on each issue and try and figure out in that issue what the answer is in that case, to that case only. We want something to tell us the answer to everything. God, just give me a sign, I'll know you're there, and then I know everything. We want simplicity. We want a simple answer to everything. And the problem with that is that A, there is no simple answer to everything, and B, we are lazy. and we don't enjoy exerting ourselves, especially in areas of theory and conversation and discussion, it's much simpler to just say, I understand it already. Or there's something that explains all this, but I'm not going to worry about it. Happens all the time with anti-Semitism, right? So let's just flip the whole conversation around. Something happens to a Jewish person, anti-Semitism. Well, maybe this person doesn't hate Jews. Maybe this person just happened to choose a victim that was Jewish. They didn't hate Jews, right? But it's a grand theory of everything. Every bad thing that happens to a Jew, anti-Semitism. We don't have to think about it anymore. We don't have to think about whether it's a social problem. Now, it's a cardinal sin of a Jewry today, at least mainstream towards the right Jewry, to give any justification for anti-Semitism. You can't say that we caused it to ourselves. You can't say that we've done something wrong that caused other people to hate us, and that's rightfully so. I don't think it's a bad thing to have that policy. But what that means is you're saying the conversation is over. We didn't cause it. Anti-Semitism caused it. Grand theory of everything. Who caused anti-Semitism? Oh, that's from Jacob and Esau from all those years ago. Esau represents all of the non-Jewish world. Oh, even though Esau was the father of the people who lived in the southwest of Israel, southeast of Israel. That's not a question. I'm not going to answer. Doesn't matter. Anti-Semitism, discussion over. That's the simple thing. What number was Jackie Robinson? He was number 42. So if you know what this is, you know why I said Jackie Robinson. It was a red herring. Does anybody get this joke? Just please, somebody get the joke. One person, thank you. Ask him to explain the joke to you later. So one small adjustment to how we analyze evil, especially, but really anything, can change the whole thing. And this is always true. This is always true because what we do is we ask this question. How could they do that to me? That's the question we ask whenever we're trying to understand evil, bad things happen in the world. And the me is not just me, it's society, it's my friend, it's the person I love, whatever it is. The person I relate to, the person that I think is innocent, that's me. How could they do that to me? And that's the finger pointing at them. How could they do that to me? That question is going to lead to all the wrong answers because it's going to be a simplistic answer. It's going to be an answer that fits into predetermined biases about general things. The correct question is not, how could they do that to me? That's the wrong question. This is the correct question. What would it take for me to do that? And if you say, I would never do that, remember where I said it was going to be hard, you have to be honest? You're not being honest. There are feelings that we would have, that every human would have, that would cause them to do things that they would never do under any other circumstance. The question of what would it take for me to do that is the way we can pass the simplicity barrier. Because it can't be simple anymore. It can't be that there's an answer why they do it. It doesn't matter why they do it. And that's why we ask this question. Asking why they do it gives us no new information. It just gives us the information that we want to give to answer the question to make ourselves feel better because it's simple. But the answer to this question is instructive. Because whatever it would take for me to do that thing does not mean that they went through the same thing that I did. It doesn't mean that they had the same experience that I did. But it must mean that whatever feelings I have based upon that experience that would make me do what they did is the same feeling that they have. It sounds complicated, because it is. I'll use a little bit of math. If the reason that I do something is A, it doesn't mean that the reason they do something is also A. But if the reason I do something is A, because A makes me feel like X, then the reason they do something is B, which makes them feel like X, or at least something similar. So we're not thinking anymore about the circumstances, the conditions, the truth. We're thinking about what their feelings are, and if we can't figure out how to get there, we think about what would get us there. And now you start to see what the problem is, which we'll get to soon, and why people don't want to do this. But empathy, in a typical sense, with people in this room, we're all friends here. So I don't mind thinking what it would take for you to do something that maybe I wouldn't do. It's not hard for me. I don't think you've done anything that would make me feel so uncomfortable about that. So we're going to start with this easy side. The easy side is, what would it take for me to do that? And don't think about the hard questions. Don't think about those things that are horrible, that are evil, that you never want to do. Let's just start with the things that are simple or easy, that things that people do, but that we wouldn't do. Right? I would never eat something, like I keep kosher, but I cannot imagine ever eating an insect, a bug, like not like a gnat. I'm talking to like crunchy bug, right? The things that people sell in the markets in like third world countries. Then I watched, American Race, The Amazing Race, and they have a challenge where they have to eat these things. I'm like, I would never be on The Amazing Race because I wouldn't be able to eat this stuff. But the truth is, if I was on The Amazing Race and I wanted to win $1 million and they were in front of me, I probably would eat them. I just don't feel the $1 million that they do. That's a simple form of empathy. It's saying, I'm not trying to figure out whether they like it, whether they don't like it, but what would it get for me to do it? $1 million? Probably. The Torah itself gives us this kind of analysis, when it talks about paying damages. So if somebody causes another person harm, physical harm, then we owe them civil damages. And the question we ask to pay those civil damages, the amount is, what would it take for you to do the same thing to yourself? That's empathy. What would it take for me to do that? But all these things are hard. It requires self-criticism. It requires introspection, which is hard. And the hardest parts about this are honesty, and then after the honesty is validation, saying that those honest feelings are true. And we don't like hard things. And because we don't like hard things, we don't want to do them. That is the first barrier. The first barrier is asking this question and honestly answering it in a way that validates our own experience and their feelings, and that's hard. Now we're going to go back to the other of the barriers. We talked about simplicity. Now we talk about resolution. Now, what do we mean by resolution? So resolution is a word that I use that describes the experience of having an answer. Not a simple answer, but an answer. We don't want ends to be untied. Maybe people say, I need to tie up my loose ends. No, you don't. What do you need to tie them for? Something going to happen if your loose ends aren't tied? We just built this idea into our society that we need to tie up loose ends. Maybe you don't. We have a bias towards resolution. We want things to be as easy as this. 1 + 1 = 2. We want to have a simple formula that gives us an answer. Nobody would, people feel uncomfortable. I've seen this actually happen. You write 1 + 1 on the board, you put an underline underneath it, and somebody has to run up to the board and write 2. They need the answer there. We're not okay with just a question. This applies all over, right? So we want answers, like we said before, that answer everything. But we also have to think about that we want answers. We want resolution. We want things to have been decided. Give us the end. Tell me the story. Tell me the end of the story. People want to know what happens at the end. Right? I didn't like the ending, so it ruined it for me. That's so stupid. Who cares about the ending? If the story was great, then it's great even if the ending is bad. They ruined the ending. All right. What about the rest of it? We don't like that. We don't like being stuck in the place in the middle where we don't have an answer. We set things up very black and white, very right and wrong, very much spy versus spy. And we like when things are over, done, and the tension is gone because we don't like tension. It makes us uncomfortable. This was the discomfort that was spoken about earlier. We were talking about fear of being uncomfortable. What's the discomfort? Where does it come from? The discomfort is tension, is unresolved things. If you go to a place inside of yourself that doesn't have answers, you're uncomfortable. There's tension. It's uncomfortable to have tension. We don't want tension. People want to reduce tension. Stress-free environment. No, stress is good. What good ever happened in a stress-free environment? Stress is the thing that makes stuff happen. Tension is the thing that makes things happen. And there's a much stronger bias towards this among people that are older than me. Because something happened when I was a kid. That. Google. Because it used to work. You used to be able to tell people there were answers to things. There is a Santa Claus. There is a tooth fairy. There are answers to everything. But now, you try to tell a kid that there are answers to everything, and before you finish the answer, they've asked their phone the answer, and well, there's 9 different theories about this question. It doesn't work anymore. So for my generation, especially, resolution is actually not possible. This is postmodernism. It makes people uncomfortable. No absolute truth. There's no answers. There's no right. There's no wrong. But there isn't. You know, we can no longer be as certain about being right. There's too much data. There's too many good ideas. And there are too many things we haven't tried yet that we can't know for certain what's right, what's wrong. You can rely on things that you value, tradition, logic, experience, but to assert with certainty, I know, with truth, resolution, the answer is here, and it's answered, is not something that is easy to do today. It's uncomfortable for people that are younger than me, and it's something that the people that are used to resolution are having to struggle with. It's a hard thing to deal with. Just finish this example, and we'll come to you in a second. I have a friend who says his favorite day of the week is Shabbat, because you could BS anyone and they can't look it up on their phone. People keep Shabbat. They don't use their phones on Shabbat. So you say what you want, and nobody can fact check you. But the rest of the time they are. I'll watch videos on YouTube. On one screen I have the video, on the other screen I am typing questions into Google, seeing if the person, what they're saying is true. This is not something that I'm doing as like an academic exercise. This happens as an automatic, instinctual reaction. People from our generation have a harder time accepting axiomatic truths. We will Google you. And therefore, we have created a kind of space where attention is no longer necessarily a bad place to be. And there's an awareness that asserting that you're right is ineffective anymore. Being right doesn't matter. Who cares if you're right? Maybe you're not right. So this idea, the wealth of information and data that we have, has changed how we look at being right, resolution. And this is the second barrier to empathy for people, especially people who are accustomed, need to feel resolution. What were you going to say?
Okay, so again, I'm not sure if we're playing this out in personal relationships or talking about politics, but I have I'm going to give 2 quick examples. Number one, I have a friend that's always a victim, and at times it's hard to be empathetic because the person's always a victim. They want to play the victim role. So again, similar to what you said, has nothing to do with being empathetic. It's sometimes hard to that. I have another person who has a dying mother, and not necessarily coming up with an answer on Google, but as a friend, being empathetic, how can I help this person set up boundaries, for themselves, so they don't have to be in that role?
We're going to answer that in a second. Both of those things will be addressed, and we're going to try and not zip through the end. We're going to get through the end, and at a perfectly normal pace. But I just want to be able to get there. Okay, so I promise that will be answered. And the other questions that I said will be answered. Some have been, and some will be. Okay. So because we are now aware that being right is not an effective way for understanding others, there is a new tension that evolved. The tension is between being right and being effective. So, do you want to be right, or do you want to be effective? Now, I'm going to check out this highly accurate diagram. On the left, we have right, and on the right, we have effective. The right is blue, but the left is blue, and the effective is red, and the right is red. We did this way on purpose. Because being right and being effective are 2 different things. And this is a Venn diagram of when being right and being effective overlap. Very rarely. Being right and being effective overlap just a little bit. And that's the place where it's easy. Right? You're right, and you can be effective. You can tell somebody something interesting that you're right about, and you can have an effective way of communicating it, or it's an effective way of existing. That's easy. But look how much space exists outside the easy space, where we're right, but it's not going to be effective. or we can be effective, but we may not be right. So we have to choose. And effective people don't always worry about being right. Right? Think about a disagreement with your spouse or significant other. You know you're right. But is it going to be effective to say you're right and to insist you're right and stand on ceremony for being right? Probably not. I speak from experience. Being effective in relationships so often means saying it doesn't matter who's right, it matters how we feel. And that sounds like emotional hippy-drippy, but it's true. Being right doesn't matter that much. It matters a little bit, but because we've devalued the rightness levels that exist, there's inflation of being right. Everybody's right now. You'll go look it up on Google. It's now more about being effective. And so effective people don't worry about being right. They don't worry about whether they will win the argument. They don't want to win the argument because they're right. They want to win because they're being effective. They want to create harmony. And so once you're in a place where you're no longer interested or concerned or wrapped up in being right, everybody's a negotiator. And everything's a negotiation. So bad people use this nefariously. They're like, I don't need to be right, I'll just be effective. And they start doing things that are harmful because all that matters is that I'll be effective. And good people use this to be good. They say, I don't need to argue the facts. I will show you that what I'm saying is useful or is well-meaning. And Shatner will get you a good price on airfare. But it's hard because we want resolution. We want to be right. We want everyone to agree with us. And therefore we stand on ceremony until they do. And we don't give up. Or then we eventually do give up, but begrudgingly. Because we know we're right. And that's what's hard. We can just change how we think about it and be less concerned about being right, but it's not easy. We have a strong bias towards resolution, being right. And if I'm wrong, prove that I'm wrong. Don't just tell me I'm wrong. Don't just say I might be wrong. Prove it. And that is a second barrier. So we move away from right and wrong. It means that we live in a world of tension. And the tension is like this postmodern subjectivity of, there's no objective truth, and people can say whatever they want, people can feel whatever they want, they could all be true, and people get annoyed about this. But it happens. It's a world that we live in. It's like there's this tension now that people are in this space of saying that there is subjectivity, and some people think it lacks conviction or it's childishly naive. And too much of this, familiar with this guy? That's the shrug emoji. Yeah, whatever. The whatever generation. And moving away from right and wrong, I know this is very important. I'll make sure you get this. This is for your nieces and nephews, your kids, whatever. It means living in a place that is subjective. It means living in a place that we do shrug. But there is an advantage to this. We now live in this tension. We can be in this tension. And instead of finishing at the end of the race and getting to the finish line, where people think life happens. People think life happens after you're done with the race. Dr. Phil has a book, Life is Not a Sprint, It's a Marathon. Which implies that when you get to the end of the marathon, that's fine, that's good. But I disagree. Life is not a sprint, life is not a marathon, life is running. So there is no finish line. The finish line is 6 feet under. We can now appreciate that there is no resolution. To try and seek resolution and to seek ending all the tension, that is to seek death. Life happens in the struggles. When we have certainty, the tension is gone, we have nothing. That is not the goal. That is the goal that we are trying to avoid. We shift our focus from getting past stress and past tension into a place of saying, I embrace stress, I embrace tension. That is where life happens. In fact, we all do this already, but we do it with art because art is a higher level of communication. A guitar string, I was told who this was, a guitar string only makes a sound when there is tension. Music only sounds good by the tension it creates, physically speaking. But all art does this in a metaphor as well. A good poem is good because it's ambiguous. There's a tension in what it means. Mystery is beauty. When you don't know everything about a person, they're mysterious. There's beauty in that. When things are completely exposed, there's less beauty in that. And we see this in music. We see this in painted art, photography, poetry, good writing. We see it in Torah as well. But because it's tension that we're seeking, and we're actually going towards the tension, we're trying to jump into that tension, it's going to get dirty, and it's going to be messy, and we have to roll up our sleeves and get dirty. Empathy can be messy. But if we acknowledge that life happens in the struggles, and we should embrace the tension, then we can do it. But if we say, I'm just going to sit this one out until it's over, you miss the whole thing. Every time you have a disagreement, every time you have an issue with someone, every time you have stress, that's an opportunity. That is not something to avoid, that is something to embrace. When we look at it like that, we've answered our resolution barrier. Because resolution is actually a bias, but it can be unlearned. We can teach ourselves to enjoy the tension and to find beauty in mystery. So we've now conquered empathy. I'm kidding. We've talked about it enough that we can have a meaningful discussion in the few minutes we have left about the conversation that we were supposed to have. And all this takes us to the next question. Empathy for our enemies. Should we try to empathize with terrorists? Or is that treason? So all until now we've been talking about stuff that we all do. Friends, family, all that stuff. But now we're going to talk about the hard stuff. What do we do when we're not even sure if we should empathize? And now we have the same two barriers as we had before, but this time they are more pronounced. We have simplicity, and we have resolution. And we said that simplicity meant that empathy, in the case of simplicity, means that we have a bias towards not understanding things on their own terms. We have a bias towards understanding them in a general sense. But now, once we have understood that, we also have another bias of simplicity, where we say that if we are empathetic, it equals support, like you said earlier. If we are empathetic, it means that we are giving a justification or an excuse for the behavior. Because even empathy, it turns out, can be oversimplified. But that's not what empathy is. It doesn't mean that at all. And the same thing with so simplicity is actually a bias and a barrier, but the truth is that it's complexity. That is what empathy is. So it's okay for us to have empathy towards somebody but not agree with them. That's the whole point of empathy. It's realizing that it's complex. And similarly with the tension, we ask the sophisticated question instead of the simple question. We ask the question of, we don't need an answer. We just want to be in the tension. That's where we were. So we said it's not resolution, but it's tension. So we go for tension. But in this case, when we're talking about resolution, we think that it means, when we're talking about terrorists, resolution means that we have an answer. We'll figure it all out, but we have a bias against that because we want to figure it all out. But empathy seems to say we're not going to figure it all out. It seems to say maybe there's a way that they look at things that makes some sense to them. And that there's a tension between the way we understand and the way they do. Embrace that tension instead of saying somebody's right. That's how we started with resolution. We said somebody has to be right. But if you're right, you may not be effective. And being right doesn't help. Who cares if you're right? Do you ever change your mind because you thought somebody else was right? No, you change your mind because you were self-interested. So we have to go for tension. And when we look at the bad guys, we see them. We say, I don't want to think about them. That's a very simple version. 3 men with guns. They want to kill me. The resolution is easy. Somebody tries to kill you, you kill them. That's resolution. But that doesn't solve anything. Because you know what that is? That is a way of looking at truth that splits being right from being effective. And I don't care so much to be right as I care to be effective. And we shouldn't care so much to be right as to be effective. This sounds provocative. It sounds crazy. But the truth is, and this is true, that being right doesn't mean anything unless you're talking about the scoreboard in the sky. What we need to do is be effective. And when we are effective, then we will have a solution that embraces tension but actually works, because we can live with tension. The only real right solution would be to just end all people that are like that. And that is not an option, and it shouldn't be an option. So we're going to have some tension. We're going to have some challenges in between. We're going to be in an in-between place. So what you have to do is think about them. Ask that question. What would it be that make me do that? Ask the question of, I don't need to have an understanding or an answer. I can be in this place of non-resolution, of tension. And it changes our expectations. But more importantly, it changes the conversation. Why does it change the conversation? Because we change from a unilateral answer to everything to a bilateral answer to everything. And which guy looks like he's going to stay on that for longer? The bilateral one. A unilateral answer, a resolution, even tension, is imposed on people. It tells people what to think. It says, I'm right, and because I'm right, you must obey. And when you enforce that on people, you are this guy. And this guy doesn't win. This guy tries to control people. That's Jafar from Aladdin. He is using magic to force people to do things. That's the bad guy in the story. He is enforcing a unilateral position. We don't want to have fake change. When you force somebody to do something, I mean, this is easy stuff. When somebody forces you to do something, how do you feel? You don't like it. Maybe one day you're like, oh, I figured out why it's valuable or it's important, but generally speaking, we dislike being forced to do things. Nobody wants to be told what to do. And when we are told what to do, it creates negative feelings. That's unilateral acquiescence. That means that we are obeying. We don't want people to obey. We want people to cooperate. We want a bilateral solution. We want to be these guys. Now, you look at these guys, they're friends. But the movie Toy Story is actually about these guys were enemies. The old toy, Woody, was mad that Andy got a new toy, Buzz. And he was antagonistic towards him, and he was trying to win. But then they became friends. This is simplistic, but they became friends, and that means that we work together towards change. And the only way to work together towards change is to say that fault is not relevant. Being right is not relevant. Being truthful, being the better ones doesn't matter. It only matters insofar as our own personal or maybe moral in the sky, God's accounting of us. But in terms of practical solutions, we all know that being right doesn't matter. We all know that practical solutions, being effective, matters. And because bilateral change is the goal, that is more important than being right and being moral. And I know this sounds terrible, and I am sorry for offending everyone. But this is how we approach problems in every other part of our lives effectively. We don't try to force people into solutions. We don't try to paternalistically tell people how they must act and how they must feel. If we do that, it might work a very short time. But if we want to be effective, we work together, Buzz and Woody. So how do we change? And I use this because this is the change machine. You go from the sneeches that have no stars, the sneeches that do have stars. And we need to figure out how to convert ourselves and everybody from just being empathetic or thinking about these in theory into this conversation, which is very difficult. Spoken word is very clumsy. How do we do this? From higher to lower communication. So I just have 4 pieces of advice that are so quick, but they will something you could think about. First of all, you have to avoid sound bites. Things are simplified in sound bites. The reason we like sound bites, it's attractive to us. It's a sound bite because it's fun to have things that are simple. When you look online for advice about how to give a presentation even, it says, speak in sound bites. Say something that can be tweeted in 140 characters or less. That's idiotic. That is the way of not communicating. Okay? You have to avoid sarcasm. You have to avoid Socratic questioning, philosophical pandering, to people, to say to them that, you know, if you just thought the right way, you would see it the right way. And we have to emphasize that the bad guys are bad and the bad guys are wrong, but we're not discussing their morality. Their morality doesn't change anything. We have to understand that there is so much noise in the conversation that only the most extreme opinions can cut through that noise. And we have to be the ones to rise above that. We're going to end with a quote from To Kill a Mockingbird. Atticus tells Scout, if you can learn a simple trick, Scout, you'll get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb inside his skin and walk around in it. We are discussing effective change with empathy. We're not discussing right and wrong. We are discussing how to approach this. And the answer to this question is that there is empathy in foxholes. It does not matter that we are empathetic to people that are immoral and that are bad and that are wrong. What does matter is that we can try to be effective. And it is not it's not being a traitor. It is not treason, because it is not about who we agree with and who is right and who is wrong. It is about understanding, because there is a way to understand evil. There is a way to talk about terrorism. There is a way to move beyond the simplistic and conclusive positions. And that is what we're supposed to do, to try and solve problems, not merely rely on the biases we have towards simplicity and resolution. It is hard, but we do it anyway, because life happens in its struggles, and that is where we will see success. Thank you for listening.